Welcome back to part 2 of the two-part series, Sins of My Brother. Burdened with a shocking truth, Daryl now has to confront those responsible for him going to prison. The air in Marcus's upscale apartment hung thick with the scent of expensive cologne and unspoken accusations. Daryl stood awkwardly in the meticulously designed living room, the stark contrast between its polished surfaces and the grit of his own life, a palpable reminder of the chasm that had opened between them. Marcus, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, looked thinner than Daryl remembered, the lines etched around his eyes hinting at a life less carefree than he projected. "So?" Marcus began, his voice smooth, almost too smooth, a practiced veneer over a simmering tension. "You wanted to see me? About Michael?" He didn't look at Daryl, his gaze fixed on a shimmering cityscape visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the glittering towers of Chicago a silent witness to their impending confrontation. Daryl didn't bother with pleasantries. He'd spent too many sleepless nights wrestling with the truth to waste time on social niceties. "The DNA results are conclusive, Marcus. Michael isn't my son." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Marcus didn't flinch, didn't offer the expected denial or outburst. He simply turned, his eyes finally meeting Daryl's. There was a flicker of something in their depths, fear? Guilt? Daryl couldn't be certain. "I knew you'd find out eventually," Marcus said, his voice losing some of its practiced nonchalance. "It was only a matter of time." "You knew?" Daryl's voice was raw, laced with the bitterness of betrayal. "And you let me believe you let me raise him as my own?" "It wasn't that simple," Marcus replied, his voice low. "There were complications." "Complications?" Daryl scoffed, the word echoing the hollow mockery of their shared past. "What complications justify raising a child in a lie, Marcus? I did prison time for this. What kind of man are you?" Marcus ran a hand through his hair, the gesture revealing a sudden tremor in his usually composed demeanor. "I was young, Daryl, naive. I didn't know what to do. Shonda was pregnant, and I was terrified." He paused, staring at his hands as if they held the weight of the world. "Our father, he wasn't exactly the picture of paternal support. The fear of facing him, of his disappointment, it paralyzed me. I didn't think I could handle it. I panicked." Daryl listened, the anger slowly giving way to a chilling understanding. He had always been the older, stronger brother, the one who shouldered the responsibility, the one who absorbed the brunt of their father's anger and disappointment. Marcus, the younger, more charming brother, had always seemed to skate by, avoiding the pitfalls that had ensnared Daryl. Now, the truth revealed a different story, one of fear and desperation, a hidden battle fought in the shadows of their shared childhood. "He would have killed me. End," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "He would have destroyed me. End." The mention of their abusive father, a looming presence in their lives, brought a wave of memories crashing down. Daryl remembered the fear, the constant threat of violence, the pervasive sense of insecurity that had shaped their childhoods. "And Shonda?" Daryl pressed, his voice calmer now, the raw anger replaced by a weary curiosity. "Why did she go along with it?" "She was scared too," Marcus said, his gaze meeting Daryl's again, this time with a hint of pleading. "She was terrified of losing everything. She loved me, Daryl. She still does." The revelation was a bitter pill to swallow. The image of Shonda, the woman he had loved and lost, now appeared in a new light not as a conniving betrayer, but as a woman caught in a web of fear and desperation, a victim of circumstance just as he had been. "She loved you," Daryl repeated, the words a hollow echo in the opulent apartment. "More than she loved me? More than she loved our son?" "It's not that simple," Marcus insisted. "She loved you both, but she was desperate, Daryl. She didn't want to face the consequences." He shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his confession pressing down on him. "I know it doesn't excuse what we did, but I was a coward, Daryl, a complete and utter coward. I ran away from my responsibilities." The conversation drifted back to their shared past, their childhood in the rough South Side neighborhood, the constant struggle for survival, the ever-present threat of violence. They spoke of their father, a violent and unpredictable man who had cast a long shadow over their lives, creating a sense of insecurity that followed them into adulthood. They spoke of their mother's quiet suffering, her silent strength in the face of adversity. They spoke of the unspoken rivalry, the competition for their father's approval, a competition that had inadvertently shaped their destinies. The unspoken resentments, long buried, now bubbled to the surface. Daryl remembered the times he'd defended Marcus, taken the blame for his mistakes, shielded him from their father's wrath. He remembered the quiet sacrifices he'd made, the dreams he'd relinquished, all for the sake of his family. And now, he learned that his brother's actions had been rooted in a fear that had been equal to his own sacrifices, a fear that had ultimately led to the destruction of his own family. The city outside, a vibrant tapestry of lights and shadows, seemed to mirror the complex emotions swirling within the confines of the apartment. The sounds of Chicago, the distant wail of sirens, the rumble of traffic, the laughter and shouting echoing from the streets below served as a stark reminder of the harsh realities of their lives, the backdrop against which their fractured brotherhood had played itself out. Marcus's confession wasn't an apology, not really. It was a confession born of guilt, a desperate attempt to explain, to justify, to mitigate the damage he had inflicted. But it also revealed a vulnerability Daryl hadn't seen before, a fragility masked beneath a facade of success and charm. As the conversation wound down, the reality of the situation settled heavily upon Daryl. The destruction wasn't just about Michael's paternity, it was about the erosion of trust, the shattering of a bond forged in the crucible of their shared childhood, the unraveling of a family fractured by years of secrets, unspoken resentments. The weight of their shared history, the burden of their father's legacy, had created a chasm between them, a chasm that the confession had only partially bridged. The road to reconciliation was long and arduous, its path uncertain. But the first step toward healing had been taken, a confession made in the shadows of a city that had witnessed their triumphs and failures, their joys and sorrows, their shared past and uncertain future. The truth, however painful, had been spoken, and the journey towards reconciliation had begun. The city lights outside seemed to glimmer with a sense of hope, a fragile spark in the darkness, mirroring the possibilities, however uncertain, that lay ahead. The drive to Shonda's apartment was a blur, the familiar Chicago streets a kaleidoscope of muted colors under the gray November sky. The weight of the conversation with Marcus pressed down on Daryl, a suffocating blanket of guilt and betrayal. He'd known Shonda for years, had loved her fiercely, had believed in their life together. Now, the foundation of that life lay in ruins, shattered by a secret that had festered for nearly a decade. He found her apartment unchanged, a familiar refuge of worn furniture and faded photographs, a stark contrast to Marcus's opulent penthouse. He found her in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove, her back to him. The scent of something spicy chili perhaps hung in the air, a sharp contrast to the sterile cleanness of Marcus's apartment. The years had etched lines on her face, but her eyes, still bright and defiant, held a familiar spark. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the small space. She turned, her face registering surprise. And a flicker of something else, fear? He couldn't quite decipher it. "Daryl," she said, her voice tight, controlled. "What are you doing here?" He went straight to the point, the carefully rehearsed words tumbling out at a rush. "The DNA test," he said, his voice low, heavy with the weight of his revelation. "Michael, he's not my son." The spoon clattered to the floor, the metallic sound jarring in the sudden silence. Shonda didn't speak for a long moment, her eyes wide, her face pale. Then, a surprising defensiveness flared in her gaze. "Marcus told you, didn't he?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He's always been the one to run and hide." The unexpected anger surprised him, jarring him out of his own self-recrimination. He'd expected tears, accusations, perhaps even a shred of remorse. But this staunch defense of Marcus, this immediate redirection of blame, was a new level of confrontation. "It wasn't just Marcus, Shonda," he replied, his voice strained. The test proves it. Michael isn't my child. She turned away, her back to him, shoulders shaking. The controlled facade crumbled, revealing a raw vulnerability he hadn't expected. He was scared, Daryl, she finally whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Terrified. He watched her, the anger slowly ebbing away, replaced by a growing understanding. This wasn't just a matter of paternity. It was a tangled web of fear, desperation, and hidden truths. He'd always been the stronger one, the one who faced their abusive father's wrath head-on. Marcus had always seemed to escape the brunt of it. Now, he was beginning to understand the weight Marcus had carried, a burden he'd kept buried beneath a veneer of success. Scared of what? He asked softly, his voice gentler now, attempting to unravel the layers of deception. She turned, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Of your father, Daryl. Of what he would do to Marcus. He was only 19, barely a man himself. He panicked. I panicked too. She paused, taking a deep breath, the story spilling out in fragments interspersed with sobs. Your father would have destroyed him, Daryl. He would have made his life a living hell. The memory of their father was a cold, sharp knife twisting in his gut. The man had been a force of nature, a shadow that had haunted their lives, shaping their identities, their fears, their choices. The fear Shonda spoke of resonated deep within him, the shared trauma of their childhood binding them in a painful way. And, what about me? He asked, the question barely a breath. What about my place in all of this? What about Michael? She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and sorrow. You were a good father, Daryl. You loved him. But Marcus was his father, and I was caught in the middle, terrified of losing both of them. The weight of her confession was heavy. He'd always believed their marriage had crumbled under the strain of his imprisonment, the financial struggles, the distance between them. Now he saw a different story, a story of fear and deception, a story where she had chosen to protect her lover, even at the expense of his own family. The conversation stretched on into the night, a painful excavation of their past, a peeling back of layers of lies and unspoken resentments. He learned about the impulsive nature of their relationship, the whirlwind romance, the swift marriage, the unexpected pregnancy. He learned about the constant fear of exposure, the silent agreements, the compromises that had eroded the foundation of their family. He learned of the burden of keeping the truth from him, her love for both him and Marcus intertwined with the agony of living a lie. She didn't excuse her actions, nor did she attempt to justify her choices, but her vulnerability, her raw honesty, peeled back layers of his own anger and betrayal. He saw not a betrayer, but a woman trapped in a web of fear and circumstances, making the most difficult decisions she could under immense pressure. The weight of their shared past was suffocating, a suffocating weight of regret and unanswered questions. The night ended not with reconciliation, but with a fragile understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the pain and the burden of their fractured history, a shared sorrow that revealed a deeper connection than the lie had masked. As dawn broke, painting the Chicago sky in shades of grey and rose, Daryl walked out of Shonda's apartment, the city's cold air biting at his skin, but the weight in his heart was lighter, though heavier with the understanding that the path toward reconciliation would be long and arduous, fraught with challenges, but a path nonetheless. He knew the road ahead was long, the journey towards forgiveness and healing far from over, but for the first time he understood the depth of Shonda's turmoil, the complexities of her choices, and the weight of the secret she had carried. The shattered pieces of their lives, still scattered and jagged, hinted at the possibility of a future that was uncertain, but no longer completely hopeless. The walk back to his own small apartment felt surreal, the city noise a distant hum against the roaring turmoil in his head. He'd left Shonda's apartment with a fragile truce, a shared acknowledgement of pain, but the weight of his own actions settled heavily upon him. He wasn't just a victim in this situation. He'd played a part in the crumbling of his family, his own blindness and stubborn pride contributing to the years of lies and unspoken resentments. He hadn't been the perfect husband. The years of incarceration, the financial struggles, his own self-absorbed anger, these were not excuses, but factors that contributed to the widening chasm between him and Shonda. He'd been so focused on his own battles, his own survival, that he'd failed to see the quiet desperation in Shonda's eyes, the subtle shifts in her demeanor that hinted at a hidden burden. He'd been blinded by his own pride, refusing to acknowledge the possibility that he wasn't the center of her universe. A flashback hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was 16, watching his father, a hulking shadow of a man, berate Marcus for a minor infraction. Marcus, younger, smaller, flinched under the torrent of abuse, his eyes wide with terror. Daryl, ever the protector, stepped forward, taking the brunt of his father's rage. He'd always been the shield, the buffer between their father's violence and his more vulnerable brother. He'd worn that role like a badge of honor, never realizing the price Marcus paid for escaping unscathed. That memory was followed by another, sharper, more vivid. He was 22, just out of high school, fighting for Shonda's attention, his own insecurities amplified by his father's relentless criticism. Marcus, seemingly effortless in his charm and success, was always a shadow in the periphery, successful, seemingly carefree, while Daryl struggled to make ends meet. He'd resented Marcus, a resentment fueled by his own shortcomings and the competitive nature of their strained relationship. Now, staring at the peeling paint of his apartment building, he understood the origins of that resentment. It wasn't just envy, it was a deeper, more profound insecurity, a fear that he wasn't good enough, strong enough, worthy of the love he craved. His father's shadow had been longer than he'd realized, its reach extending into his adulthood, coloring his relationships, his perceptions. He'd been so busy fighting his father's ghost that he'd failed to see the real battles fought around him. He saw the way Shonda had looked at him that night, the mixture of guilt and sorrow in her eyes. It wasn't just about the paternity of Michael, it was about a lifetime of fear, a constant struggle to protect her family from the monstrous specter of their shared past. He'd been so consumed by his own pain, his own struggles, that he'd missed the silent pleas for help, the unspoken burden she carried. He realized he hadn't just failed Shonda, he'd failed Marcus as well. He'd been too quick to judge, too slow to understand. He'd seen Marcus's success, his seemingly easy life, and assumed he'd escaped the trauma of their shared childhood. He'd never considered the weight of the secret, the constant fear of exposure, the emotional toll it must have taken. The guilt was a suffocating weight, heavier than any prison cell. He'd spent years blaming Shonda for the failures of their marriage, for the distance between them. Now, he saw her choices as survival strategies, desperate measures born out of fear and desperation. The anger he'd felt towards her dissipated, replaced by a profound sadness, a recognition of their shared history, the wounds they both carried. The image of his son, Michael, flashed through his mind. A boy who'd innocently lived a life built on a lie. He'd been a good father, he truly believed that. He'd loved Michael unconditionally, pouring all his affection and energy into raising him. But the lie, the secret, cast a shadow over everything, a profound sense of betrayal that pierced him. He needed to talk to Marcus, to understand the complexities of his brother's decisions, the circumstances that had led him to conceal the truth. He'd always seen Marcus as the smooth operator, the one who navigated life with effortless grace. Now he saw a different picture, a man haunted by his past, burdened by secrets, living a life of carefully constructed facades. He knew the conversation with Marcus wouldn't be easy. Years of resentment, unspoken words, and simmering anger had created a chasm between them. But he owed it to himself, to Shonda, and to Michael, to try to bridge that gap, to uncover the truth, and perhaps find a path towards forgiveness and healing. The weight of his past actions, the weight of the secret, and the weight of his own self-recrimination were almost unbearable. But he had to carry it. He had to face it. He had to begin to understand the fractured bonds of his family and to understand his own role in their unraveling. Chicago's winter night pressed in on him, cold and unforgiving, but the icy air couldn't quite match the chilling reality of his own shortcomings. The road to reconciliation was long, but for the first time in a long time, Daryl saw a flicker of hope in the darkness. The journey to heal himself and his family would be difficult, but he was finally ready to embark on it. The weight of the past, while heavy, would not crush him. He would carry it, learning from it, striving to build a better future. The future was uncertain, but the desire for reconciliation, for understanding, burned brightly within him. He would start with Marcus, then maybe, just maybe, he could start to mend the fractured pieces of his life. The next morning, the city's usual cacophony felt amplified, a jarring soundtrack to the turmoil brewing inside Daryl. He'd spent the night wrestling with the revelation, the DNA test results a cold, hard truth that shattered the carefully constructed facade of his family. He pictured Michael, his son, a boy he loved deeply, and the lie that had underpinned their relationship for 9 years. The guilt was a physical burden, a weight in his chest that made it hard to breathe. He decided to call Shonda. The phone rang several times before she answered, her voice tight with a weariness that mirrored his own. There was a strained silence before Daryl finally spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "I need to see you," he said, the words barely a whisper. "We need to talk." Their meeting was in a small, dimly lit diner on the south side, a place they'd frequented during their courtship. The familiar surroundings offered little comfort. The air was thick with unspoken words, years of resentment and unspoken truths hanging heavy between them. Shonda's eyes, usually bright and full of life, were shadowed, reflecting the burden she had carried for so long. "I know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know about the test." The confession was a release, a shared acknowledgement of the devastating truth. But it also opened a floodgate of emotions. Shonda's story unfolded, a narrative of desperation and fear, a desperate attempt to protect her son from the harsh realities of their lives. She spoke of her own insecurities, her struggles to make ends meet, the fear of being alone, and the pressure to provide for Michael. The secret, she confessed, had been a desperate act of survival, a shield against the potential chaos that would have engulfed them had Daryl known the truth. Daryl listened, his anger slowly dissolving into a profound sadness. He saw himself in her struggle, the familiar shadows of their shared past, and their father's relentless cruelty casting its dark influence over their lives. He recognized the desperation in her decision, a desperate attempt to keep her family safe from the storm that lurked around them. The conversation wasn't easy. Accusations were exchanged, tears fell, and the pain of their fractured relationship hung in the air. But amidst the hurt, a sliver of understanding emerged. They acknowledged their individual failures, the mistakes they'd made, the ways they had hurt each other. They acknowledged that they had both been victims of circumstance, trapped in a cycle of pain and desperation. It was a difficult path to reconciliation, a long road ahead of them, but it was a start. The next challenge was confronting Marcus. Daryl found him in his high-rise apartment, a stark contrast to Daryl's humble abode. Marcus, always the smooth operator, seemed initially unnerved by his brother's visit, but the veneer of composure quickly crumbled. The conversation began tentatively, filled with awkward silences and strained pleasantries, but soon the years of unspoken resentments poured out. Marcus's confession was a heartbreaking narrative of guilt and self-loathing. He spoke of his own insecurities, his fear of failure, the weight of his father's expectations, and the constant pressure to succeed. He'd always felt like he was playing catch-up, a persistent shadow in his brother's wake. The affair with Shonda had been a reckless act of rebellion, a desperate attempt to break free from the shadow of his older brother and their father's crushing dominance. His success, he admitted, was a hollow victory, a facade masking deep-seated pain and regret. Daryl listened, his heart heavy with the weight of his brother's pain. He'd always viewed Marcus with resentment, seeing him as a symbol of everything he lacked: ease, confidence, success. But now, he understood the depths of his brother's struggle, the burden of a secret that had defined his life. He finally understood how Marcus was also a victim, scarred by the same brutal hand that had shaped his own life. Their conversation was a raw exchange of pain and remorse. The years of unspoken words and simmering anger finally found release. The resentment Daryl had harbored toward Marcus dissipated, replaced by a deep empathy for his brother. They acknowledged their shared pain, their shared past, and their individual failures. They both recognized the monstrous shadow cast by their father, the unseen hand that orchestrated their dysfunctional family. The conversation concluded not with resolution, but with a shared recognition of their shared wounds and a fragile agreement to begin to heal. The revelation of Michael's paternity rippled through the extended family, shaking the foundations of their lives. Aunts, uncles, and cousins reacted with a mixture of shock, anger, and confusion. Gossip spread like wildfire through the close-knit community, exacerbating the already strained relationships. Daryl and Shonda found themselves facing the judgment of those who had previously held them in high regard. The challenges were immense. Rebuilding their relationship with their extended family would be a long, arduous process, demanding forgiveness, patience, and an honest reckoning with their past. But the initial waves of shock and anger gradually subsided, replaced by a tentative acceptance, a gradual understanding of the circumstances that led to the secret. Daryl began to understand the deep-seated issues that had fueled their dysfunctional family dynamic. The cycle of resentment, fueled by their father's abuse and neglect, had scarred them all. The men in the family learned to hide their emotions. This led to a cycle of anger and resentment, as unspoken needs created deep rifts and damaged their familial bond. Daryl recognized that he too had played a part in perpetuating this pattern, his own anger and self-centeredness contributing to the unraveling of his family. His journey towards reconciliation was not just about confronting the truth about Michael's paternity. It was about confronting the truth about himself, about his role in the fracturing of his family, and about healing the deep-seated wounds of his past. It was a journey of self-discovery, of understanding, and of forgiveness. It was a long and arduous journey, but one that Daryl was finally ready to embark on, his heart filled with the hope of healing, even as the harsh realities of Chicago life continued to surround him. He had a long way to go, but the path forward, though uncertain, was beginning to emerge from the shadows. The frigid Chicago wind howled outside, mirroring the storm within, but this time he felt equipped to face it, to weather the storm one step, one conversation, one act of forgiveness at a time. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Daryl felt a glimmer of hope. He was ready to fight for his family, for the possibility of healing, for the chance of building a better future, a future free from the shadows of the past. The weight of the DNA test results settled heavily on Daryl's shoulders, a constant reminder of the chasm that separated him from his son, Michael, and the brother, Marcus, who had unknowingly fathered him. Seeking forgiveness wasn't just about appeasing Shonda and Marcus, it was about seeking absolution for himself, for the years of self-imposed blindness and the resentment he'd harbored towards his younger brother. Chicago's unforgiving winter mirrored the emotional landscape he was navigating, a bleak, icy expanse that seemed to stretch endlessly before him. He started with Shonda. Their subsequent meetings weren't held in the cozy confines of their old diner. The familiarity had become tainted, burdened with the weight of their shared secret. Instead, they met in quiet corners of the city. A hushed library tucked away on a quiet street. A bench overlooking Lake Michigan. The vast expanse of water a silent witness to their confessions. Each meeting was a painstaking excavation of their past, unearthing buried resentments and shared traumas that stretched back to their harsh childhood, marked by their father's unpredictable violence and their mother's heartbreaking cue. Silence. Shonda's anger, initially sharp and unforgiving, gradually softened, replaced by a weary acceptance. She spoke of the relentless pressure she felt, the financial strain, the fear of judgment, the crushing loneliness. She detailed the agonizing choices she'd made, each one born out of the desperate attempt to protect Michael from the instability of their lives. Daryl listened, his own bitterness slowly dissolving into empathy. He understood, finally, the depth of her desperation, the terrible weight she'd carried alone for 9 long years. He saw in her eyes a reflection of his own failings. His incarceration, fueled by his own irresponsibility and fueled by the anger he had inherited from his father. He recognized the cyclical nature of their pain, a pattern of destruction passed down through generations, and he felt a profound sadness, not just for his own actions, but for the generational trauma they were both battling. "I can't undo what's been done," Shonda said one evening, her voice thick with emotion as they sat in a deserted park, the city lights casting long shadows around them. "But I need to know you understand. I need to know you're going to be there for Michael, regardless." Her words weren't a demand for forgiveness, but a plea for understanding, a request for partnership in the challenging years to come. He nodded, the simple gesture a commitment to a future built on honesty and shared responsibility. The task was daunting, a mountain to climb, but for the first time he felt a glimmer of hope. Seeking forgiveness from Marcus proved more daunting. Their brotherly bond, always strained by competition and unspoken resentments, had been shattered by the revelation. Marcus, the successful one, the one who seemed to have effortlessly escaped the confines of their impoverished upbringing, had built a wall around himself. Their initial conversations were stiff and formal, an awkward dance around the unspoken truth. Marcus, however, was unlike Shonda. His defenses were higher, the emotional scars more deeply buried beneath a carefully constructed facade of success. He initially deflected Daryl's attempts at reconciliation, bristling at any mention of shared guilt or responsibility. He blamed his father, then the circumstances of his childhood, but never himself. Daryl's persistence, however, chipped away at Marcus's defenses. He patiently listened to Marcus's justifications, his carefully constructed narratives of his past. He allowed Marcus to vent his anger, his frustration, his self-loathing, without interruption. He acknowledged Marcus's pain, his own sense of inadequacy in the shadow of his brother's apparent success. He even admitted his own contributions to the broken family dynamic. He had never truly appreciated his younger brother, always viewing Marcus as a symbol of privilege. This was a privilege Marcus had fought tooth and nail to obtain, only to find himself wrestling with his own demons. Slowly, painfully, Marcus began to unravel. He spoke of his deep-seated insecurities, the constant pressure to live up to expectations, the agonizing loneliness behind his success. He confessed to feeling like an outsider, a perpetual observer in his own family. His relationship with Shonda was a desperate cry for connection, an attempt to break free from the cycle of resentment and isolation. "I never meant to hurt you, Daryl," Marcus finally confessed, his voice choked with emotion. I wanted something different. I didn't know how to get it." Daryl saw in Marcus's confession not betrayal, but a reflection of his own fractured self. The same pain, the same insecurities, had manifested differently in each of them. He had just managed to express himself through anger and resentment, whereas Marcus hid his pain under a cloak of achievement and indifference. Their reconciliation was not a sudden burst of forgiveness, but a slow, arduous process. It involved long, difficult conversations, shared memories, and a gradual recognition of their shared wounds. They started to acknowledge the role of their father in their dysfunctional dynamic, the legacy of abuse and neglect that had shaped their lives. They also began to acknowledge how their own failures had perpetuated the cycle. Forgiving Marcus wasn't easy. The initial anger, the years of resentment, lingered. But Daryl recognized the need for forgiveness, not only for his brother, but for himself. Holding on to the anger only perpetuated the cycle of hurt. Letting go, however, was a significant step towards healing. The journey towards forgiveness was a long and arduous one, marked by setbacks and moments of doubt. The city of Chicago, with its relentless energy and harsh realities, provided a constant backdrop to their emotional struggles. But amidst the challenges, a fragile hope began to take root. A hope for reconciliation, for understanding, and for the possibility of healing the deep wounds of the past. It was a slow, painstaking process, but Daryl was committed to it, committed to rebuilding the fractured bonds of his family, one act of forgiveness at a time. Will Daryl be able to forgive his brother and wife so that he can move on, or has these scars left a permanent mark on him? How will this affect the child? Thank you for tuning in to PTSD, True Crime Stories.